Hello, and welcome to the first lecture video for English 122. It's Professor Parish. How are you guys? I'm sitting here in my SIC shirt with my Discovering Literature textbook and with a PowerPoint and some fun stuff for us to go over. So I'm excited to show you guys this first video as we go through chapters 1 through 4 in our Discovering Literature textbook. And I'm going to make this as fun as I possibly can and kind of show you what all we look for in the book, what you should be looking for in terms of studying for the test. We're going to go over paper 1 guidelines, the outline guidelines, all the things that are on this wonderful English 122 homepage. So before we start, as you can see, I am on our homepage. If I scroll down, you will see in our handout section this MLA citation presentation. Please read that presentation. I will have a separate video that I will send to you all in the announcement section, a video about the MLA presentation. If you want, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel. It's Professor Parish on YouTube, and there's my photo on there, so you'll be able to find me. And you can subscribe and get video updates, or you can just keep checking your announcements. And for example, this video I'm going to be posting on the announcements as well. So if you have looked at week 1, hopefully you have been up here to the discussion forum. You have been to either the weekly assignments or course content and have been submitting your assignments. The discussion posts I've read so far have been fabulous. So it has really got me excited for this semester. And hopefully you have looked at chapter 1, which is the preview chapter in our textbook, and also looked at the reading to write in the concise Cengage handbook. So this video is actually going to cover the readings of chapter 1, but also for week 2 we're going to talk about chapters 2, 3, and 4, which are 56 through 60, 91 to 96, and 135 to 140 in your textbook. And hopefully you've checked out the concise Cengage handbook, Understanding the Rhetorical Situation. I will go ahead and say up front that there are a lot of passages in the Cengage handbook that are similar to the Wadsworth. So we're not really going to go over in this video those first couple of readings from the Cengage handbook because I feel, one, they are very similar to the Wadsworth handbook. So if it seems a little repetitive or like you've been there before, it probably is. But 2, I really want to focus on starting fiction with this first video. Now we are going to touch on the Cengage handbook in some of our later videos, so don't worry, we'll get to it. But for today we're going to focus on this good old giant hunkin' textbook here and start going through that, as well as our guidelines for paper 1 and our outline. So please make sure that you look through those readings as you watch, after you watch, or before you watch the rest of this video. Alright, ready to dive in? I guess to start out with, we're going to talk about the book. We're going to save the outline and the guidelines for last in this video. So I have constructed this PowerPoint, which I will upload to our week 2 handouts. So if you would like to pause this video, go to our homepage and download this PowerPoint so you too can follow along, you can. Or you can just watch the video and then check it out later. Up to you. I'm going to pull up our PowerPoint here. And here we are. So, Discovering Literature, chapters 1 through 4. Alright, so before we actually start with chapter 1, there is a section in our textbook called the Introduction, and it's labeled The Promise of Literature. It sounds very old-fashioned. But I have in this book several handwritten notes that I've put in throughout the years that I've taught this class, and so I can never return this book because they won't take it back. I wrote in it too much. But if you look in the textbook on pages 1 through 5, I believe, they give you little nuggets about the type of reader that you should be, the type of ways you should interact with text and approach text, and it's a good insight. Basically, when we read, we are kind of our own self-literary critics, which means we read and look at any text, whether it's fiction, poetry, drama, nonfiction, the news, a magazine, even things that are like social media, the moment we read them, we view them through a certain lens that has to do with our backgrounds as people, as our culture, our society, where we've grown up at, the people we've interacted with. We look at everything through a specific lens. And some people, when they write, can identify what that lens is. So for example, when we get to drama, we will see several different authors view Hamlet through different lenses, be it a feminist critique, or perhaps looking at a psychoanalytical critique. Whatever the case may be, they view things through a certain lens or way. And that's kind of how we view everything. That's why some people like certain books and other people like different books, because we interact with them in different manners, and that's what makes literature interesting. It's not like math or science where it's very concrete and there's only one or two ways we can view something in math or science. In math, for instance, 2 plus 2 is always going to equal 4, right? In literature and in grammar and language, it's a constantly evolving and changing process. Take grammar, for instance. One of the questions I ask a lot for students is it that I slayed the dragon, or is it that the dragon was slain? Is it slain or slayed? And some students will think about it and they'll go, oh, well, the dragon was slain. And others will be like, no, it's slayed. The interesting thing is you're both correct. The more traditional, old-fashioned Old English, or rather Middle English, way of doing it was slain, but our vernacular and our language has changed so much that we've adopted slayed, the ED version, as being correct as well. Language is a constantly changing, fluid thing. It's why Shakespeare can be so hard to understand, because we don't use the same vernacular and language that Shakespeare used. We don't say thou shalt do this or thou art not. We don't use that language. It's become obsolete. So that's why I find it fascinating. So whenever people talk about literature and how we view it, it's almost like you're your own YouTube critic. You are your own critic as you read. You find things that you like about text and you find things that you don't like. And that's what I hope that we bring out in this class. This idea that we can examine a text. I'm hitting the textbook as I give this presentation. We can examine a text, we can pull out what we like and explain and articulate that, but we can also talk in our discussion forums about things that we don't necessarily like, or maybe don't understand, or find confusing or interesting or fascinating, and we get to talk about that. So even though we are on an online forum and we can't talk face to face, the nice thing is we have a discussion forum to voice our opinions about the text. So that little rant was basically to sum up that I really like the first couple pages of this book because it brings that out. All right, but we are going to skip forward to chapter 1, which starts out with a preview of literature, of fiction specifically. And I would like to include nonfiction and what we will call creative nonfiction in this unit, because a lot of people, when they think of literature, they only think of fiction. They see the term prose and they think, oh, fiction stories like fantasy, sci-fi, romance. But we can also include creative nonfiction, which is where people tell memoirs or narratives about their life, but they do so in a creative way. It's not just like a police report where it's a fact by fact. I was born on May 8th. I'm not going to tell you the year. But it's not like that. It's like, on a sunny, bright day in May of the 8th day of blah, blah, blah. You can be more creative with it and treat it like prose, like fiction, but it's true events. And we'll talk more about that with paper 1. So anyway, chapter 1 starts out with our view of the earth. How fitting. And it talks about steps for us to become better readers and writers of literature and the analyses of various pieces of literature. And I've kind of, you can see, or maybe not see here, I have highlighted and underlined numerous times in this book different notes. I would encourage you to write notes in your book. Just do it with a pencil in case you're going to sell this book back. which I can't imagine any of you doing that. You'll keep this in your library forever, right? I know what you're going to do. But anyway, they talk about different steps to becoming someone that can interact with prose. And the steps they list here are, to one, read with an open mind. A lot of times we have to sit down and try to realize, what is the author's purpose in this text? What are they doing? Why are they writing the way that they're writing? And a lot of that has to do with learning where the author comes from, what time period are they from, are they being sarcastic, is this satire, and we'll talk about what those words mean, or are they being serious? And you have to read with an open mind, because you're going to read things, whether it's in this class or in the future with your other classes, that maybe get you out of your comfort zone. That you might be like, oh, that's weird, or I don't know if I like that. But the idea is that read with an open mind, but also keep in mind why you don't like something, because that's important. It's a reflection of who you are, but also of your tastes, of what you morally believe, and it's very important to know that. So just keep that in mind. This is the hardest one right here, number 2, hardest one for students, and I understand your struggle. It is real, and that is read a story more than once. Who has time to do that? I was always frustrated as a college student with this aspect the most, because we live in such a fast-paced society. I've told some of you in the discussion forum for week 1 that I have a list saved on my computer of stories to read that I will probably not get to until I retire, because we just don't have time to read things more than once. It's very hard to do so. If you do get a chance, though, it is encouraged, because it's sort of like when you watch a movie the second time. If you go see a good movie and then you're like, oh, I need to go see that again to catch all the little details, it's the exact same way with a book. The more you read a book, the more little nitpicks, things you're going to find that you didn't see the first time around. I've got some of my favorite books that I will go back and read passages of, because I know I'm going to find something new when I go back and see them. So that's what that's meaning. And of course, with any type of prose, but especially fiction, use and I have younger cousins, although SpongeBob's been around for 20 years now, so there's that piece of information that makes you feel old. But the whole imagination, that's, every time I hear that word, that's what I think of. But you really have to use your imagination when you read any type of prose, because it's the whole idea is that you are creating the movie in your mind. And you have to use the details the author gives to paint a picture. And I think that separates good authors from bad authors, in that, can you paint a good picture with their words, or are you kind of like, it's vaguish mush. So, no, that's just my opinion. Allow your emotions to come into play. When you read something and you don't like it, as I said earlier, be aware of why that is, because that does say something about you and what you believe in your tastes in literature. I've read stories that I couldn't stand and had to walk away from. I would say, and we'll talk about this later on, but The Grapes of Wrath, my friend recommended that I read The Grapes of Wrath, and so I did. It's a very long novel. It took me a while over the summer to get through it, and I remember getting to the last page, and I was so frustrated with how the story ended, I literally chucked my book across the room. I was like, nope! Chucked it out, and I was so frustrated by it. And then I had to think of why, and we'll talk more about The Grapes of Wrath later in the fiction unit. But just stories that make you have a visceral reaction. When I read 1984 by George Orwell, there was a point, I was reading it on the beach, which it is not a summer beach read by any means, but there I was doing it. And I got to a point of the story where a very horrific incident happens. And I remember I had to shut the book, put it down, and I had to walk away from it for about a day, because I was just so horrified by what I read, because I got so caught up in the story, and then I got to this certain point and I was just terrified and disgusted, and I had to just shut the book and put it away. It's a fantastic book. 1984 is a classic, but if you get involved in it, then you'll know when you get to that part of the book why it's disturbing, and then you just have to walk away. But those are the best types of stories, when your emotions get to be a part of the reading experience. Try to get the sense of the story as a whole. Some people are like, I read the first third and I got rid of it. I would encourage you to read more. Now, by the time you get to the last third of the book, if it's been a total snooze fest, you might be like, eh. But I've read several books, the first 50 or 60 pages, garbage, boring, and then once you got to the middle point, you're like, oh, this is starting to pick up, and then by the time you get to the end, you're like, oh, this is an awesome book. So I would encourage you to try to keep going with the story. Don't just stop at the beginning. Think about your reactions, and that kind of goes back into the emotions coming in play and reading with an open mind, and then talk with other readers, which, congratulations, we're in a giant forum of other readers, and we will all likely be reading similar things throughout the semester, so you will have a forum to voice your opinions. It's almost like this was planned. But I would encourage you, that's why people have book clubs. And it sounds really cheesy and lame, but it's because you read something and you want to share that experience. And so this is kind of like our own personal academic book club for the semester. So, 7 elements of fiction. We're going to talk about those. Chapter 1 sets all of those up for us. Setting. Simply, where are we and when are we? Usually when people think of setting, they think of just the place, but the time is also critical of where the story takes place, how technology comes into play, how social conventions are held. Time has a lot to do with the setting, and it's a pretty important part of that element. The character. Who? Is it a human? Is it humans? Is it like the brave little toaster and they're all inanimate objects? Is it nature? Is it the character is the central figure that the story revolves around, or that interacts, that we see the story through, that is our kind of guide through the story and what happens. Speaking of what happens, the plot. That is what that element is, exactly what it is. And the plot in the story can vary wildly. It can be something as simple as, I walked to the mailbox, got the mail, and walked back, and that's the story. Or it can be something as lavish and embellished as Lord of the Rings, or War and Peace. I would say that character, plot, and setting are the 3 very crucial elements that you have to have in a story. Without one of those 3, your story won't be complete. The last 4 elements, though, can vary wildly depending on the author and the story itself. Point of view is not only, and what I mean by who is telling the story is, what is the narration? Is there a narrator? Is it in first, second, or third point of view? And we'll talk about that a little later. But how is the story told is basically point of view. Symbolism, what extra meaning does the story have? And symbolism is probably the most varied element, because sometimes an author will use a very little amount of symbolism, very little, just enough to kind of mix things up. And then other authors like J.K. Rowling with Harry Potter uses so much symbolism and draws so many references from mythology, from other texts, from history, that everything has a symbolic meaning. It's insane. So, yeah, it can vary wildly. Along with plot, character, and setting, your story should probably have a theme, and that is, what's its purpose? What is the point you're trying to make to an audience? Now, theme can vary quite a bit. Your story might be very simple. Maybe it's just good versus evil, or maybe it's the phrase pride goeth before the fall. Maybe it's a simple theme, or maybe it's very, very complex and it has multiple layers. I mean, it's usually authors can kind of tend to the theme as they see fit. And then finally, the most varied element is style, and that's how the author uses language. When we get to our 2 excerpts from the story Beautiful Boy and Tweak, you will see a very diverse range of style. The story Tweak that we're going to read an excerpt from is in very raw, short, choppy sentences that's almost like texts back and forth. Whereas Beautiful Boy, which they are making a movie out of, and I'm really excited to see it this coming year, is written from, the author of Beautiful Boy is a journalist, so his writing is very flourished, it's very extravagant and well put together, and meanwhile Tweak is actually a story by his son who is struggling from a drug addiction, and it's written like someone who is addicted to a drug. They're very lack of focus, very sporadic, erratic text, And you can tell that just by the way he writes. And the two stories are edited differently, to where the father, who writes Beautiful Boy, his writing, you can tell, has been edited and picked with a fine-tooth comb to make sure everything is the right text, language, grammar, everything. Tweak, on the other hand, has very minimal editing, where it's just basically left how Nick Sheff wrote the story. So there's grammar errors, there's formatting errors, it looks weird at times, and it's supposed to, because it's supposed to be a raw description of what he's writing while he's addicted to drugs. So we'll get to Tweak and Beautiful Boy, but I'm always excited for this class to read those excerpts, because they're basically the same story written from two people's perspectives, and I find that fascinating. But we'll talk more about Tweak when we get to later PowerPoints, and Beautiful Boy as well. So, Chapter 2, or rather, yeah, Chapter 2 is all about setting. You will notice as we go through these PowerPoints that this textbook is huge. There's no way we can get through all of it in 16 weeks. I mean, I guess if you wanted to sit down and just read it, you could, but what's the fun in that? So really, with this textbook, you will notice each chapter there are pages of terminology and main concepts, and then there are example stories. And we're going to pull a lot of example stories from this textbook to talk about as a class, but in these PowerPoints and in my lectures, I'm mainly going to be going over the first couple of pages of terminology, and then whenever there's terminology throughout the chapter. So you'll notice we switch pages in very big bursts. It'll be like page 2 and suddenly we're on page 30. And we're just skipping the sample stories. All right. So setting, for example, we're going to start with page 56 and 57. Look how far we've come already. But the idea of setting is that depending on the narrator, that depends on the point of view, and also we have things called dialogue, which some stories have lots of dialogue, some have very little. And I've given you guys kind of an example of dialogue here and how to write it. So when you write dialogue, notice that there's always a comma before you start the dialogue, and then there's always punctuation inside the quotation marks. So you want your entire text and punctuation inside your quotation marks for your dialogue. And what I mean by this here is when I was in college as an English major, I took several creative writing classes, and my instructor, Ms. Hartman, one of her biggest pieces of advice would be that she would ask you, as you're writing dialogue, to go sit in a coffee shop, or sit in the library, or sit on the train, on a bus home, wherever you're going to, and eavesdrop on people's conversations. And it sounded really creepy at the time, but one of our assignments in the class was to go to, there was a coffee shop right next door to our building where our English class was, and we were supposed to go to the coffee shop, sit there for 20 minutes, and write down the dialogue we were listening to. And it was kind of creepy, but at the same time, I remember my dialogue was this guy and this girl talking about one of their classes. And I wrote down basically what they said. And it wasn't anything personal. They were just riffing about a teacher they didn't like. But I noticed after I wrote it down that the dialogue was very raw, like short, choppy sentences. It didn't sound like what you'd read in a textbook. And we brought back our pieces of dialogue, and she's like, that's how real people talk. You can tell people in a book that sometimes authors write dialogue just as book people talk, but not how real people talk. And I would say Stephen King's a good example of this. If you ever read Stephen King's work, you might notice that his dialogue is very embellished and elaborate. And then when you think about it, you're like, would people in real life actually talk like that? I don't know, maybe. But if you're writing dialogue for a story, you have to think, how would these people talk in real life? So I've kind of given some examples here. And then always, as you're writing dialogue, you can interject with a little description of what's happening as they're speaking. But if you do that, just make sure you break your quotation marks and pick them back up. All right. So an overview of plot and point of view, and we'll get to these PowerPoints where we go over the entire chapters later on. But suspense holds a reader's attention through mystery and intrigue. I like suspense books and suspense movies because I love plot twists. I love when things take a dramatic turn you don't expect it, and people are fascinated by that. I mean, think of all the shows that we have out there that go over like true crime investigations and Law and Order. I mean, grim and gruesome things people are oddly fascinated by because it's something we're not familiar with. And we want to learn, why do people think like that, or why do these things happen? It's kind of human curiosity. And a lot of stories try to have that same effect. Point of view. Through whose eyes are we looking at the world on page 37? I love that definition of point of view because it's so true. That's exactly what it is. There are 3 types. I would argue that first person and third person are our most popular types of point of view. First person is basically in a diary format, so anything involving me, or I did these things, or it was me, told from your point of view or the main character's point of view. That's first person. Third person, I think of Harry Potter, always. And that's when we use pronouns like he, she, they, or actual names like Harry Potter did this, and Hermione and Ron did that. By the way, I'm a Ravenclaw, just so you know. I'm curious to see what house, if any of you are Harry Potter fans, what house you fall in. But yeah, that's third person. And then second person is the least popular because it's the most uncomfortable. And what I mean by that is that we rarely see text written in second person because second person involves the pronoun you. Probably my favorite example of second person is Chuck Palahniuk. He wrote the book Fight Club, which was a movie in the 90s. He's wrote a lot of other fiction, and his stuff is very kind of macabre and strange, but he really likes the second person point of view. And it's uncomfortable to read it because he basically writes, you decide to go to the grocery store. Then you decided to steal a candy bar. And as you're reading, you're like, no, I didn't do it. I didn't steal a candy bar. Why are you blaming me for it? No. But that's how he writes. So he puts you in the position of the main character. And a lot of times he puts the main character in very uncomfortable or offsetting situations. And it's hard to read because you think to yourself, that's not me. I'm not doing these things. But in the text you are. So it's a very interesting perspective. I've had students try to write in second person, and it's not easy. But if you want to challenge yourself, try writing something in second person point of view. It's fun, but it's a challenge. So symbolism, we've talked about that a little bit already. Those are things like colors, names, mythology. For example, when we see a stoplight, there's no words on the stoplight, but we know that when it's red, that means what? Stop. And when it's green, it means go. The stoplight doesn't have words to tell us these things, but we know through symbolism that that's what those colors mean. And colors have a very huge symbolic effect depending on your culture, depending on your region, names, mythology, etc. We'll go over more when we get to the symbolism chapter, but authors can use a lot of these little symbols throughout their stories to help give their works more meaning, more context, and help give readers a better connection to the characters in the story. Like I said, we'll talk more about that later. And then theme, we've talked, is the meaning of the story as a whole. The texture of a story means the details, the dialogue, whatever makes the story embellished or rich. You know, there's a difference between a story that a first grader might write and that an adult writes. And that's usually in the texture. A lot of times if you read like little kid stories, they're all basic, essential plot points. It's like Sally went to the store, then she got milk, then she made cake. Like all like beat, beat, beat. Just event 1, event 2, and event 3. The texture is where you get into the dialogue, descriptions of characters, descriptions of setting and place, and the time period that make the story have a bigger, larger feel to it. Alright, and then first impressions versus running commentary. Our text, chapter 1, talks about this a little bit. That is just, first impressions are simply that, what you initially think after you read the story. So if you're doing first impressions of a story, you would read a story from its beginning to end and then write about it. So you'd be like, okay, I watched the movie, now I'm going to tell you my top 10 favorite things about it. A running commentary is that you make notes and observations as you read. So if you write in the margins of your book, that is a running commentary because you're making notes as you read the selection. If you are watching a film and taking notes while you watch the film, that is a running commentary. If you just look at the film in its entirety, or read a story completely all the way through and then comment on it, that is a first impression. So that's the difference between those two things. Personally, I'm usually a first impression writer. I like to watch something all the way through without being interrupted and then write about it, but I've done some reviews of TV shows, and usually those are running commentary because there's commercial breaks, and usually during the commercial break I can write notes and then jump back into the show. So both ways can be effective. Alright, and then our textbook on page 53, they talk about types of brainstorming, and you guys have probably seen this in high school a lot. Clustering, listing, the little word bubbles. Our book gives a lot of good examples of brainstorming on pages 53 and 54. The capsule portrait, we did this actually in a creative writing class. It's a lot of fun if you like writing short stories. That's where you give basically like a little biograph of the character you make up. So their likes, their dislikes, their personality, what they look like, their philosophy. You kind of get to create a person. It's kind of fun. It's like The Sims, but with more. And also, I didn't update this. No! But your Cengage handbook, not the Wadsworth, your Cengage handbook does have some information on brainstorming. So, oops. But you guys know to check the Cengage handbook. But it actually does have a section on brainstorming, which I appreciate. And I know that in English 121, you guys probably looked over the brainstorming section in the compact reader, and I really like that section as well. So those are good resources to have. Alright, I got a little ahead of myself earlier, but now we are on page 57, chapter 2, setting. There are basically 4 types of setting, and you guys are going to have a test over fiction at the end of our fiction unit, and I will ask you about these 4 types of setting. So please make sure on page 56 and 57 that you look over these types of setting. Not every setting fits into one of these 4 examples, but I would say 90% of them do. The first type of setting is a mirror. And a mirror setting is exactly that. It reflects the mood of a story. So for example, an author could use the desert as an example, and maybe usually think of Star Wars in The Force Awakens or A New Hope, when we see Finn in The Force Awakens walking through the desert, and he's like sweating, and he's desperate, and he's tired, and he's exhausted. That desert is actually mirroring what his emotions are. And that's the author's intent, is to make us feel like Finn feels, and the desert helps to amplify that feeling of loneliness, desperation, exhaustion. So that would be an example of mirror setting. A mold setting is setting that shapes the characters, and the prison is a perfect example of this. So shows like Orange is the New Black, or movies like The Shawshank Redemption, or even, heck, even The Grand Budapest Hotel, where the character is in prison for part of the film. Those are all mold settings. They help to shape the characters and how they think and act and react. And usually if a story is set in a prison, or any setting where it's kind of like an imprisonment environment, that is a mold. That's what that is. Escape setting is where we are kind of taken away to an imaginary or daydream, dreamlike place. And my favorite example of that would be Alice in Wonderland, because the whole point is that Alice is living a humdrum Victorian life, and she's very constrained by the way society has basically dictated how she should act. And then Wonderland, there is no rules, there is no dictation, there is no Victorian society. And so it's kind of like an escape for her. And there's a lot of stories that use the escape setting to kind of challenge societal conventions or notions of how we should think, act, and, exist. And then finally we have the alien setting. And alien does not mean just space. I know I put space as the example, but it is not just alien in the sense of extraterrestrials. An alien setting can be anywhere where the character in the story feels lost or hopeless or in the complete unknown. So If a character is homeless, they may be in an alien setting. If they've been picked up and moved to a new location without any warning, that may be an alien setting for them. So it doesn't have to be science fiction. It can be, a realistic setting. I'm trying to think, if you ever read a story about people during World War II that had to move in Europe from their hometown out to the countryside, or had to move to a different country to escape war, that would be an alien setting, because they're basically dealing with stuff that is unknown to them, that they're not used to, that is not their normal. And that's what that means. So just make sure you read page 57 about these 4 types of setting. They will be on your exam. Just an FYI, most of the stuff we talk about will in some shape or form be on the exam. Okay? And it won't be word for word, because I get some students that are like, well, the question wasn't word for word. What is the setting that reflects prevailing mood? So you need to not only read this PowerPoint, but you need to also look at your book. And I may reword this, but it's basically going to mean this as well. So we're going to do some critical evaluation here. All right. So relating to dialogue, stream of consciousness and interior monologue are 2 types of dialogue we talk about in chapter 2 here. That is on page 60. And stream of consciousness is basically very much Alice in Wonderland that I talked like before. It's going from place to place rapidly without any type of organization, like a dream. So if you've ever watched Alice in Wonderland or read it or seen a version of it, because there's tons of versions out there, there's not really a rhyme or reason. It just jumps from place to place and we don't really know why. That is stream of consciousness. And I would say it's pretty rare, but it does happen a lot in stories. Interior monologue is also a more rare form of setting, and that's when the story takes place in the character's mind. So page 60, we get the quote, immersing the reader in a stream of impressions, reminiscence, and half-formulated thoughts. So it's all happening in the character's head, basically. And there are not too many stories out there that use stream of consciousness or interior monologue, but they do exist. So our book does acknowledge their existence and tell us what each of those mean. All right, so you will notice in this PowerPoint that I basically will talk about the terminology and some overall concepts, and then we move on to the next chapter. So chapter 2, we've talked about setting. Now we're going to roll right into chapter 3 about character. And characters are important in stories. So we are going to jump actually to all the way, I'm looking at my book here, to page 91. Look how far we're coming already. This chapter starts out talking about round versus flat characters. And we're not talking about how they're shaped. We're talking about their character. A round character is 3D. It's complex. It has personality, motivation, and depth. Usually your round characters are your main protagonists. And we'll talk about what a protagonist is in a moment. But they are your main characters. So I'm going to use Harry Potter because it's a good example. Harry, Ron, and Hermione are very round characters. We learn about their families, we learn about their aspirations, we learn about their motivation, what drives them, their likes, their dislikes, their personalities, their worldviews. We learn everything about them almost like they are real people. And that is a round character. A flat character is just a background character that's really generalized and doesn't really have a point. So, random wizard number 3. We don't know anything about him. He's a flat character. Usually your extras in a story are your flat characters, and your main ones that you follow throughout the story are your round characters as well. Initiation is a rite of passage that takes a character from one point to the next in a story. So I like to think of the 1980s movie Labyrinth, which stars the late and great David Bowie. The main character, Sarah, in that story, she has to solve various puzzles to get to one point of the story after the other. So she goes through a series of initiations. She has to solve one puzzle to get to another puzzle. She has to solve that puzzle to get to another puzzle. So it's kind of like checkpoints. She has to keep going to make the story go on. That is an initiation. A persona is a hidden personality. So a persona is basically a mask that characters wear. So for example, a story that you think is really, a character you think is really good in the story and then turns out to be not so good in the story is someone wearing a persona. Like I said, I have younger cousins. We watch a lot of Disney. Frozen, the character Hans, he seems like a great guy. And then at the climax of the story, you find out, nope, he's bad. He was wearing a persona this whole time. He had a hidden personality that just came out of nowhere, right? And then we have minimalist, which is very simple characters with only essential traits to a story. And I find a lot of stories actually have very simple characters with essential traits. The Great Gatsby, for example, our main narrator, he's pretty simple. If you ever read the story, he's kind of one note. He's not real interesting. He's just there to be kind of our representation so that we get to view the story through his eyes. But he's kind of bland. He's very minimalist. Whereas the other characters, Gatsby and Daisy and Tom, they are more rounded characters. We know lots about them. The main character that we follow around throughout the story, he's pretty minimal. It's just kind of, you know, there. Alright, so Chapter 4, Plot. The meat of the story. What actually happens? The first term we learn in the chapter on plot, and I will tell you all the page number for that. Jumping forward to page 134 to 135. Go to page 136, actually. That's where exposition starts. So an exposition is basically a situation that our book describes has seeds of further development in it. What exposition basically is that a character will set up the mythos and setting and environment of a story, usually within a single conversation. So my favorite example of this is the scene that we're about to watch together as a class. So I'm going to go ahead and play this for you all. Make sure my sound is up.
You, Sparrow.
Aye?
You are familiar with that ship, the Black Pearl?
I've heard of it.
Where does it make berth?
Where does it make berth? Have you not heard the story? Captain Barbosa and his crew of miscreants sailed from the dreaded Isla de Muerta. It's an island that cannot be found except by those who already know where it is.
The ship's real enough. Therefore its anchorage must be a real place. Where is it?
Why ask me?
Because you're a pirate.
And you want to turn pirate yourself, is that it?
Never. They took Miss Swan.
Oh, so it is that you found a girl.
Oh no! Dang it. Okay. That's alright. So anyway, the whole point of this scene with Jack Sparrow from the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie is that Johnny Depp's character Jack Sparrow has to basically set up a ton of stuff in this very short scene. He has to set up what the Black Pearl is, which is a ship, what the Ile de Muerta is, what the curse is, the fact that Will does not like pirates, which is why he reacts that way, the fact that Will is doing this whole thing of the plot because he's in love with Elizabeth, and the fact that his name is Will, which Jack Sparrow is like, oh, you're Bill Turner's son. So all these 6 or 7 things get set up in this very short 2-minute scene, and it's all exposition. It's just for us, the viewer, to know about the world that this story exists in. And I give Johnny Depp a lot of credit because he does some interesting gestures and actions to make that exposition not seem really boring. And that's kind of hard to do because exposition is just dialogue we have to know to understand the story. And sometimes if it's done poorly, it can be very dry, dull, and hard to watch. But I would argue he does a good job of making it interesting and keeping our attention throughout that scene. So yeah, I want to show you guys that to emphasize what exposition is. So, in a story, there are 2 characters mainly, the protagonist and the antagonist. And on your exam, I will ask you to define a protagonist and antagonist. And every semester, somebody gets this question wrong. Last semester, one person got it wrong, and I was like, oh, so close. But they'll say, oh, it's the good guy and the bad guy. No. The protagonist is just the main character. If you've ever seen Megamind, or recently our culture has been obsessed with anti-heroes, so Deadpool, Venom, those are not, Suicide Squad, those protagonists are not good guys, and that's kind of the point, to tell a story from a bad guy's point of view. So even though they're bad guys, they're still the protagonist, the main character in the story. The antagonist is always just the person that's trying to keep the protagonist from their goal. So in Megamind, for example, the hero of the story is actually the antagonist. And in Suicide Squad, Batman is kind of an antagonist, even though he's the good guy. So when I ask you on your exam to tell me what a protagonist and antagonist are, the main answer that you should give is they're just the main character and the person trying to oppose them. Not good guy versus bad guy. I will count off on that because it's really important, because not all stories have that structure. Every story does have, though, either an external or internal conflict. External just means actions that are happening in the world of the story, so that are actually happening in real life, whereas an internal conflict is happening inside the character's mind. A loose narrative versus tight narrative. Loose narrative events have no clear structure and they can meander. So again, think Alice in Wonderland, think Arrested Development, that show, think Seinfeld, think South Park. They can meander sometimes. There's not really a big structure. They may have an overall theme or message, but there's no straight point A to point B to point C and how they got there. Whereas a tight narrative is cause to effect. It's point A to point B all the way through. And there's not any meandering or getting out of time order or anything like that. It's all very straightforward. Any type of documentary or nonfiction event will be a tight narrative. Whereas a show like Doctor Who, where a character goes back and forth in time in one episode, can be a very loose narrative. Okay? And then flashbacks, we as a culture should know what those are because we see them all the time. They're just breaks in the chronological sequence to show us a character's past. So when we see a flashback in the show, it's often in sepia tone or in a different tone or black and white, or it's filmed in a different way so that we, the audience, will know that we're looking at something from a different time period. And then finally, and I'm going to push this down a little bit so we can see it better. Our final slide is, this is on page 137 and 165. I know a big gap there, but there's a story crammed in between there. There's closure, climax, and resolution. The closure of a story is kind of a wrapping up or pulling together of all the events. And it's very much similar to the resolution, which is the end of the story that happens right after the climax. The climax is the highest point of action. So when we look at a story, we often think of it as sort of a roller coaster, where we have the start, the setup, we have the inciting incident or the main conflict that happens, then we have the rising action that leads up to the climax, and then the falling action and resolution. And in reality, a lot of times, the falling action might just get to right here, and then we have our resolution. Because this is more like Return of the King, Lord of the Rings, where there's like a 30-minute ending to that movie that's only 3 hours long. So the setup's where we meet our characters, and then something happens that spurns them into action, and then the climax of the action is the very height of the story, and then we go to the ending. That's usually how a story should be set up, because if it's just in a straight line like this, it's boring. If my story was just Rachel goes to the mailbox, gets her mail, and walks back to the house, it'd be like this, boop, like a flat line. It has no life. But let's say I'm going to the mailbox, and all of a sudden a truck hits the mailbox right in the house next door. Well, then there's something happening. And so then you run over to see if the person in the truck's okay. You get to the truck, you open up the door, and you realize they're fine. And then our action falls to a resolution. You go back inside with your mail. Wasn't that much more exciting? I think so. So that's basically our overview of plot, character, and setting. Obviously, our textbook has a bigger elaboration on those terms, so I would encourage you to read those sections. I'm very much a proponent of, if you need, not skim reading, but a close reading. So read what you have to do with the terminology. Go through the stories that you find interesting. We are going to look at Hills Like White Elephants for our first reading response, which is by Hemingway, which I love that story, so we will be going over it. But that is our overview of chapters 1 through 4. Hurrah! Alright, so, get out of here. I do want to show you all a few things. One is our paper 1 guidelines. I'm going to try to zoom in on this a little bit. So, paper 1, one of your assignments for week 2, is to come up with a thesis statement, or basically the topic of paper 1. So you've got several options. I'm going to zoom in even more so this is... Alright, I do like to offer creative writing options for this class because we are dealing with literature, and some of you like creative writing, so I want to give you guys a chance to kind of show that off. So these options here, these first 4, are more creative writing oriented. So you could write a short fiction story. I've had a lot of students do this. They had a lot of fun with it. I think one of my favorites was a young man in one of my classes wrote kind of a crime noir type short story where we were introduced into a setting of like a den of gangsters from the 1920s, and his character was going in, and the story ended right when he was about to go on the chase, and you're like, oh, I want to read more. But it was a really fun short story. A creative nonfiction, which means that you basically write about an event that has happened in your life, in a friend's life, or in your community, and you write it like it's a piece of fiction. So you write it like it's a prose. You're creative, it's got a beginning, middle, and end. It's sort of like a narrative, if you wrote that for English 121. Just a creative nonfiction story about your life. That's an option. A memoir, the difference between a memoir and a creative nonfiction is a creative nonfiction is usually in third-person point of view. So it's written like a narrative. A memoir is in first-person point of view and is like a diary entry. So it's almost like a journal, the entries that you're writing. And I've had students do both of these options and do very well with them. Fan fiction, usually students don't pick this option unless they already know what fan fiction is. If you don't know what fan fiction is, it's where you write a story about something that already exists. So, for example, I had a student do a crossover fan fiction for this class one year, and she took the cast of Grey's Anatomy and had them meet the cast of The Hangover in Las Vegas. It was bonkers. It was a cracker story, and I loved every page of it. It was just crackers and insane, and it was great. But she wrote me a little blurb at the start of the story that said, you know, here's the plot of Grey's Anatomy and the main characters. Here's the plot of The Hangover and the main characters. And my story is about what if those characters happened to meet up in Vegas by chance and what would happen. And that was her story, and it was awesome. So if you've written fan fiction in the past, or if you really like fan fiction, that is an option. You can do that. I just ask that you give me a note to let me know about the story you're writing about, because chances are I have not seen it or read it. Might have, but probably not. And then if none of these creative writing options look enticing to you, or if you're like, no, I don't want to write creative writing, that is okay, because we do have this option, which is just to do an analysis of a piece of prose. So basically you can pick a story from our textbook, or you can pick your own book that you have at home, and you can write an analysis of it. Now, I will say an analysis is not a book report. Book reports are probably my least favorite genre, because what they end up being is usually a summary of the plot alone. And I loathe that. Because it's one of those things where if I really wanted to know the plot of the book, I'll go out and read it. Once I've read the paper and it's a book report, I don't want to read the book anymore because it's like, oh, well, you just told me what happens, so there's that. I want it to be an analysis, so you explain to me how that book uses the 7 elements of fiction that we've talked about in this presentation. And do they use them well? Do they use them poorly? Is there anything they could change to make it better? How has critical reception of this piece been? Did audience like this book? Did they not like this book? I want you to kind of analyze the book or short story as if you were a critic and tell me what's good about it, what's bad about it, and how does it use those elements of fiction. So those are your options for paper 1. I am very much the type of person that when I was in college, I didn't like prompts because I felt like they put me into a corner. My professor would be like, write about Jane Eyre, and I'd be like, oh my gosh, I don't want to write about Jane Eyre. It's boring and has first world problems. And so I hated writing about it. So I promised myself that when I was an instructor, I would let you guys have a theme, and this theme is prose, but you guys get to pick which option you want and what story you want to write about. So that is all in your ballpark now. As long as you meet these requirements, you will be set. Your paper does need to be 3 to 5 full pages long. That 3 full pages means 1 full page, 2 full page, 3 full page. Not 1 full, 2 full, and half a page on the third. It's got to be a full 3rd page. Can you go over 5 pages? Absolutely. I'm going to stop you at 30 though. And I'll tell you more about that as the semester winds down. But you can go over 5 pages if you want. Just, you know, if you get to 15 pages or so, you might be like, okay, I'm going to wrap this up. Because I do want to be able to give you a really thorough grading on this paper. But yeah, at least 3 to 5 full pages. 12-point font, please no bold, cursive, or large fonts. I'm looking at you, Arial Bold. Don't be using it. And I can tell, I was in college. I know when students use fonts that are bigger than the normal 12-point font, so just don't do it. Please don't use cursive Edwardian script. It's hard to read. And this right here, if you look on any Microsoft Word document, you will notice that the margins are automatically set at 1-inch margins. Just leave them alone. I've had students in the past think that they are clever and try to alter the margins to make their paper narrower. I will know that you're doing it and I will count off points, so just don't do it. If you open up a Word document, just leave the margins alone and you'll be fine. Your paper should incorporate the elements of fiction discussed in class in this lecture and within our textbook. So basically, I'm going to look for the 7 elements of fiction to either be talked about if you're doing the analysis, or if you're doing a creative writing option, I want to see that they're there. I want to see that your story has a setting, that it has characters, that there's a distinct style, that there is a consistent point of view, that you are using at least 1 or 2 symbols in the story. I want to see that all those elements are at play or being talked about. The grammar and spelling should adhere to standard American English. Use good grammar and spelling is basically what that means. You do not need a works cited for this paper, so congratulations. But if you decide to use an image, a picture on your paper, some students have done that, or if you decide to quote any research, like for example in the fan fiction option, if you decide to quote the author, then you'll need to cite them. But chances are you probably will not have a works cited for this paper. And then obviously, this point, all parts are due on time for full credit. Since you have this class online, you have more than a week to do most of these parts of the assignment, so if it's turned in late, I'll give you feedback, but I'm not giving you points. So just please keep that in mind. Do not wait until the last minute. I have students every semester that will submit things. It's due at 11:55, they will submit it at 11:54, and I get panicked because I will log on some nights at 11:54 just to see if everybody's turned in their stuff, and there'll be somebody turn it in at the last minute. I'm like, what? So try to submit early. You know, you can wait till Sunday, that's fine, but you know, try to get it in before 11:55, you know, just for good measure. So here's our due dates. The thesis, by August 26th, I want to know what option are you doing and what's your topic. Just give me an idea. The outline will be due September 2nd, and then the final paper draft is not due till September 16th. So you actually have kind of a month to work on this paper, which is crazy, and you can always submit it early if you get it done early. I'm all for that. As far as the outline goes, let me pull that up real quick. I have put on our handouts this outline guideline. I'm a poet and I didn't know it. So basically, your outline assignment should include this. It should include your introduction paragraph. Obviously, for this first paper, your introduction will look a little different because you may be choosing a creative writing option and you won't have points or you won't directly state your thesis. But I do want to see like an intro to see that you've got some start on the paper. And then what I would like to know is just a breakdown of your outline. So this is an example. I have my little introduction paragraph here, and then I have my points and kind of what I'm going to talk about. And then I've noted in my conclusion that it's in development. For your paper 1, if your conclusion is not anywhere close to being done, just give me this, and that's fine, because I understand if you're still working on your paper, you're fine. I've got my information here on if you need to get a hold of me. The main thing is I want to see a bare bones structure for your paper. And the reason for this is when I started college, I hated outlines. I didn't want to do them. I thought they were superfluous. I thought they were just extra tedious things my instructor was making me do. As the classes went on and our papers got longer and more complex, I realized that I needed some way of organizing my thoughts. Or I would get to my final research paper and it is very easy to get lost in that type of paper when it's so big. So I needed some kind of structure and organization I could fall back on and say, okay, I've talked about point 1, what was point 2? And I had it right there in my outline, and it was so helpful. Outlines can literally be a saving grace in a class on your papers. I'm not even joking. So I want to get us in the habit of creating an outline for our papers. And I've put on here, these are all subjective. Your outlines, I'm not making you sign a contract and pricking your finger and signing in blood saying that you're going to stick with this. Your outlines can change, and that's totally fine. But I at least want you to have on hand some kind of structure for your paper so that you're not suffering from the 2 a.m. syndrome. And you all know exactly what I'm talking about because I've not been there because I was too paranoid to be in that situation, but I have a younger brother, and he was in that situation a lot, where he would wait until the night before the paper was due, and at 2 a.m. would sit down at the computer and go, I wonder what I'm going to write about. That terrifies me. I can't imagine being in that situation. So I want this outline to kind of break you from that habit, so that when you write this paper, you are not struggling at 2 a.m. to come up with a structure. You already have it in place. All right, so that's kind of the setup of the outline. You can check out those guidelines in our handouts along with our paper 1 guidelines as well. So they are all, I've got to go back down here. They are all listed down here in our handouts. And I will add our presentation to week 2, and in the announcements this video will be. So thank you all for bearing with me. I know it was a very long video. Not all of our videos will be this long, but obviously I like geeking out about our textbook and this stuff. So if you guys have questions, please feel free to call me, email me. I hope this video was helpful, and I can't wait to talk about our future chapters later on in the weeks to come. So have a great week, guys, and I'll see you later. Bye.